Well, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to have Neeltje here to talk about this amazing book. And the book is unusual, and I think this event is unusual, and she's unusual, because I'm sure you all know that she's a distinguished economist who has worked at the World Bank, the Dutch Central Bank, and now for many years at the Bank of England. She's an expert on international finance. But also, until recently, she was plagued by self-doubt. And about 5 years ago, she decided she was going to do something about this. And she embarked on this voyage of discovery, which was so successful that she felt she must write it up for the benefit of others. So this is a really, really exciting book, I think. And you will find her talk really fascinating. So she's going to talk for 45 minutes, including exercises that we do here or that we could do later. Okay. Anyway, things we can actually do to make ourselves better. And then we'll have half an hour of Q&A, and we'll stop it promptly at 7:15. The hashtag I was told was up there, but I don't know what it is. Let me see if it says here. Yes, here's what it says. It's hash LSE CFM. So, Neeltje.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming here today. This is my first book talk, so I'm very excited about it. I'm going to start with reading a part from my book, from chapter 8, called Inner Truth.
Can I just ask, are the acoustics working here? Can you hear what she's saying? Okay. Great.
In the relentless downpour, he stands motionless, watching as the bus retreats into the distance. His eyes, unlike hers, are devoid of tears. His face betrays no emotion. He has made his decision. He will return to Darlington Hall, back to his solitary existence, back to the only life he knows. It was never truly a choice, not for him. His entire life has centered around a single goal, to become the best butler a man can be. And, according to Stevens, great butlers have one thing in common: dignity, the cornerstone of which, he believes, is emotional restraint, a lesson his father taught him well. Years of dedicated service have honed his emotional armor to perfection, and he takes immense pride in it. Even when his father passed away, he didn't falter. His duties weren't neglected. He doesn't look back with regret, quite the contrary. He brandishes this episode as tangible evidence of his standing as one of Britain's greatest butlers. He would never admit his feelings for Miss Kenton. The thought of such vulnerability, such candor, is unfathomable to him. The closest he ever came was a muttered admission, "I'd be lost without her," when a visitor praised her housekeeping. Somewhere deep inside, he knows that her departure from Darlington Hall and her choice to marry another man were born out of his inability to confess his love. Now, 20 years later, fate offers him a second chance. Her letter revealed the unraveling of her marriage. He drives all the way to Cornwall to see her, but he soon realizes that his commitment to being a great butler and his steadfast beliefs about what that entails haven't changed. Intimacy, love, they find no room in his carefully ordered life. Everything remains as it was, and always will. I've lost count of the number of times I've watched Remains of the Day. Yet this time, it wasn't the agonizing tale of unrequited love that lingered in my thoughts, but rather the forces that fueled it. Stevens painstakingly crafted his life around two core principles. His raison d'être, his relentless pursuit, was to achieve greatness as a butler, and emotional restraint, in his mind, was what makes a butler exceptional. This was the prism through which he viewed his world, molding his perceptions, guiding his choices, and dictating his actions. Unfortunately, this mental model, so rigidly followed, left Stevens with nothing more than a life of solitude and a poignant memory of Miss Kenton and the life they could have shared. I find myself thinking about my own life. How different am I from Stevens? Truly. Obviously, I harbor no ambition to become the world's greatest butler, nor do I place much value in emotional restraint, except in certain circumstances. However, like Stevens, I view my life through a specific lens, and it affects my perceptions, my choices, and my actions. For me, the lens is that of an academic who believes she's an imposter. The constant questioning of my own abilities, my own worthiness, is a dissident backdrop of my existence. Praise and accomplishment I tend to see as a product of luck or timing, rather than a result of my skill or intellect. Failures and setbacks, on the other hand, I magnify in an attempt to validate my perceived incompetence. My constant fear of exposure stokes my anxiety and fuels an obsessive pursuit of perfection. Just as Stevens found solace in his emotional restraint, I find a straight sense of comfort in my perpetual self-doubt. Not because it's pleasant, but because it's familiar. It's the world as I know it. In many ways, this familiarity provides a kind of stability, a constant amid the chaos of life. But it's clearly not helping me. It's creating a lot of stress and chips away at my happiness. It makes me wonder, why do I cling to such harmful beliefs about myself? I needed to understand more. It's been a few years since I wrote that, and thankfully, things have changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, through small, intentional shifts in how I think, how I respond, and how I treat myself. That's what this talk is about, the power of those small shifts, because unlocking potential doesn't start with working harder. It starts with thinking differently. But before I get to those shifts, let me take you back where I started. If you had looked at my life 5 years ago, you would have seen somebody who had it all together. I was senior research advisor at the Bank of England, a full professor at the University of Amsterdam, and a recognized expert in my field of international finance. I had built a successful career, earned respect in my field, and held the kind of roles that people associate with achievement. Yet, if you had asked me how I felt, my answer would have been exhausted, stressed out, stretched thin, constantly chasing the next milestone, believing that just one more achievement, one more perfected detail would finally make me feel like I belonged. It wasn't burnout exactly, although the Times piece did make it sound like that came out on Monday. I hadn't worn myself out completely, but I was running on a kind of constant tension, one that never fully switched off. I couldn't let go of the feeling that I needed to prove myself, again and again. Eventually, something had to give, and I made a difficult decision. I stepped back. I took a 5-month sabbatical. I was at the height of my career, and it felt like a huge risk. In the world of academia, as many of you know, you're not really too expected to pause. You publish, you speak, you deliver, and then you do it again. Taking a break, especially when things were going well, felt almost irresponsible, like I was stepping out of an Olympic race just as I was gaining momentum. But I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The constant pressure and self-doubt It was wearing me down. I didn't want to leave my work behind, but I knew something had to change in how I was living my life. So I stepped away. On February 26, 2020, I shut down my computer, left the office, and gave myself permission for the first time in a long time to just be. And then 3 weeks in, the world shut down. So, the sabbatical that I carefully planned, the space I had carved out to reset, to reconnect, to breathe, collapsed almost overnight. Instead of quiet cafes and long walks with friends, I was confined to my apartment, allowed out only once a day for exercise. The freedom I was craving turned into isolation. And very quickly, the futility of persisting with this hollowed out version of a sabbatical became glaringly obvious. With a heavy heart, I decided to end it prematurely and plunge back into work. It took only 4 days for that voice to resurface. Each time I sat down to work, it whispered that my ideas were shallow, that my contributions to economics were insignificant, and that I'm simply not smart enough to do my job. I had stepped back, hoped to reset, but all I'd done was pause the noise. And now it was back, louder than ever. One afternoon, staring out the eerily quiet city below, I realized I was at a crossroads. I had two choices. I either walked away from my career and leave the pressure behind, or I stay and confront my fears and anxieties. Not silence them through achievement, but understand them, challenge them. I chose the latter. I didn't have a plan, but I started doing what I do best, research. So I dove into neuroscience and psychology to uncover anything that might help me understand how our brains work, and whether there was a different way to relate to my thoughts, my attention, my sense of self. What I discovered surprised me, not because the ideas were complex, but because nobody had ever explained them to me. It turns out the way we think, feel, and perform isn't fixed. It can be shaped through small, intentional shifts. Not grand overhauls, not sheer willpower, just small changes in where we place our attention, how we structure our time, and how we respond to self-doubt. Over time, those small shifts started to add up. I became less reactive, more focused, more in control. Not of the world around me, but of how I moved through it. And that's what I want to share with you today. Not a formula or a 5-step plan, but a set of ideas and practices grounded in science and experience that help me reshape how I think, and in doing so, how I live. So before we get into the detail of some practices, let's start with understanding our brain better. Because if we want to change how we think and behave, we first need to understand the system that's doing the thinking. Understanding just a few key insights about how the brain works helped me see my own behavior in a very different light. So these are 3 key characteristics. The first one is that our brain is a prediction machine. The second one, that it's isn't built for the world we live in. And the third one is that it can change, even in adulthood. What just happened? So most of you probably expected that I would drink this water, or that I would hold it in my hand while I was talking. You would not expect me to throw it over my shoulder unless you've seen me speak before. And that's exactly the point. Your brain was making a prediction. It constantly guesses what's going to happen next based on your past experience. And when that prediction turns out to be wrong, just like now, your brain flags it as surprising. You feel that jolt of attention, even in your body. In fact, the more confident your brain is in its prediction, the more surprised you feel when it gets it wrong. There's a direct link between the two. Everything we see, hear, feel, smell, or taste is a mix of raw sensory input and your brain's best guess about what is going on. And that guessing game isn't a flaw, it's a feature. It's what allows us to interact with the world efficiently and quickly, without having to analyze every little detail every time. Our brains aren't merely reactive, they are predictive, constantly anticipating what's coming next so we can prepare, plan, and respond. Let's test this right now. Please close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you have a piece of lemon, a yellow piece of lemon in your hand. You bring it up to your nose and you smell the citrusy smell. Then you take a bite. Feel the juice hitting your tongue. If you start to salivate, who of you started to salivate? Quite a few. That's your predictive brain at work. There's no lemon in your hand, but your brain is pulling from past experiences and preparing yourself to anticipate the sourness that it knows is likely to come. Our brain is just constantly predicting what will happen next, not consciously, but automatically and incredibly fast. That works well most of the time, but it also means we're not reacting to the world as it is. We're reacting as we expect it to be. The second key characteristic of the brain is that it's not built for the world we live in. It was shaped for a very different world. We often assume that our brain is built for modern life, but the truth is it's running on very old wiring. For most of human history, we lived as hunter-gatherers, in small groups, moving through uncertain environments and facing real immediate threats. The brain evolved to help us survive in that world. And although the world around us has changed dramatically, the design of our brain hasn't. That means we're using a system that was built for physical danger, for food scarcity, and for social survival to navigate a world filled with constant information, rapid change, and an endless stream of decisions and distractions. The first thing to understand about that system is this: it prioritizes survival, not balance. Your brain's job isn't to keep you calm or comfortable, it's to keep you alive. That's why it's constantly monitoring for potential threats, not just physical ones, like cliffs or wild animals, but social ones too: disapproval, failure, or exclusion. Today's threats, in most cases, are not life or death, but your brain still reacts the way it always has, switching on high alert. Your heart rate rises, your muscle tenses, your attention narrows. It prepares you to flight, flee, or freeze. It shifts resources away from long-term planning and reflection toward immediate readiness. Because the brain evolved to prioritize immediate safety, it tends to overestimate risk and underestimate capacity. It favors short-term reactions over long-term thinking, and it directs attention to whatever feels uncertain, unfamiliar, and possibly threatening, even when the actual stakes are very low. The second feature is that the brain doesn't like uncertainty. In our evolutionary past, uncertainty often meant danger. If you didn't know whether the rustling in the bushes was wind or predator, it was better to err on the side of caution. The bias towards caution increased the odds of survival. It was better to overreact than risk being wrong. The same bias is still active today. When something is uncertain, like the outcome of a conversation, a decision, or a situation we care about, our brain becomes more alert, It seeks familiar patterns and it tries to restore predictability because feeling in control reduces perceived risk. That is why ambiguity, when something is unclear or open to interpretation, can feel so uncomfortable. To the brain, ambiguity means unpredictability, and that can mean danger. So it tries to reduce uncertainty quickly by jumping to conclusions, imagining worst-case scenarios, or filling gaps based on past experience. Even a negative prediction often feels safer than no prediction at all. Uncertainty can also make us hold back. We delay decisions, avoid unfamiliar situations, or pass up opportunities, not necessarily because the outcome could be bad, but because it's unknown. The brain naturally prefers what is predictable over what's possible. Even when something could turn out well, our aversion to uncertainty pushes us toward playing it safe. The third feature is that the brain is designed to save energy. Our ancestors couldn't afford to waste effort. Thinking, deciding, analyzing all require energy. So our brain evolved to automate these things as much as possible. The result? We run on habits far more than we realize. Estimates say it's 43% of what we're doing is habitual. Once a pattern is established, whether it's how we check emails, how we go to work, how we respond to stress, the brain sticks with it. Not because it's the best way, but because it's the easiest. This is why change feels difficult. It requires effort to override an existing habit. But it's also why small changes, repeated over time, are so powerful. They create new pathways that eventually become automatic. And that brings us to the third key characteristics. Our brain can change even in adulthood. For a long time it was believed that the brain couldn't change after childhood, and that after childhood the wiring was set and all we could do was work around our limitations. However, we now know that that's not true. The brain remains plastic throughout our lives, meaning it can adapt. It rewires itself based on what we do, what we pay attention to, and the patterns that we reinforce. Let's try something for a moment. Turn to the person next to you and introduce yourself. But when you do so, say your last name first and your first name last. So in my case it would be, hi, I'm Van Horen, Neeltje. Please give it a go. It's strange, right? It's strange, right? It throws you off. Even if it's just your name. That's because your brain has automated that introduction for years. So even changing it in a tiny little way requires effort. You're forcing your brain to fire a different pathway. But if you keep doing it, you would get better at it. It would become normal. And that's neuroplasticity in action. At first, it feels unnatural, slow, silly maybe. But with repetition, the brain adapts, it learns, and it builds new patterns. It means that the thought patterns, emotional responses, and habits we've developed over time aren't permanent. They're not hardwired. They're trainable. That doesn't mean that change is instant, but it means that it's possible. And that simple idea that we can shape the way our brain works completely shifted how I approach my own stress, self-doubt, and mental performance. Because once I realized I wasn't stuck with the brain I had, I started intentionally building new mental habits, something I had never even thought about before. The brain is, of course, far more complex than these three characters that I've just covered. But even these three characteristics reveal something important. Our brain is shaped in specific ways, with certain tendencies and certain patterns. And when we learn to work with these tendencies, instead of fighting them, we begin to make meaningful shifts in how we think and respond. In my book, Ignite, this one, I share many of these small intentional shifts, micro-practices I call them, that have generally helped me use my brain in a more supportive way. Today, I want to focus on 3 sets of micro-practices with you that I found especially useful as a starting point for dealing with 3 common challenges most of us face. First one is distraction, the second one is stress, and the final one is self-doubt. So let's start with distraction. Most of us deal with it on a daily basis. So with show of hands, who here thinks that they can effectively multitask? Everybody wised up already, that's good. So now, who's currently thinking about something other than what I'm saying? Yes. And that's very normal. You're not alone. Our attention is constantly being pulled away in different directions. And part of the reason is that our brain didn't evolve to do deep, sustained focus. It evolved to scan the environment, to stay alert, to notice what is new or changing, and to respond quickly when something demanded action. Fast forward to today, and that same attention system is still scanning. Just now it's jumping between emails, messages, tabs, information, headlines. And while we might feel productive switching between tasks, research shows that multitasking isn't actually multitasking. It's task switching, and it comes at a cost. Every time we switch a task, our brain needs time to reorient, to recalibrate. And even when we move on, part of our attention lingers on the previous task, especially when the first task was not completed or when we were doing it with limited effort. This is known as attention residue, and it makes it harder to fully focus on what's next. Task switching doesn't only cost time, it affects the quality of our work, increases the risk of mistakes, and it makes it harder to retain what we've just learned. You probably know that, if you think about it. And there's another cost, which we overlook: energy. Scattered attention is tiring, so every time we switch, we redirect, or we try to juggle multiple things, we draw on the brain's limited supply of mental energy. Is one reason we feel drained after a day of busy work, even when we have not done any of the things that mattered to us. So what can we do to help us regain focus? There are 3 micro practices that, if you take them together, they're extremely powerful, but you can even do them separately. So the first one is minimizing task switching. One way to support your focus before you even begin is to reduce the amount of switching that your brain has to do, because your brain loses momentum every time you switch between tasks. So before you start work, take a moment to group similar tasks together, things that use the same kind of attention, like answering emails, or reading a document, or analyzing data. Switching between these tasks asks your brain to recalibrate, which drains energy and breaks momentum. But when you batch similar tasks, your brain can stay in the same modus, which makes attention easier to sustain and less tiring to manage. Of course, no matter how well you organize your time, it's hard to focus when you're constantly being interrupted by an email, a phone message, or something else. So the second micro practice is to block out distractions. Your brain can't focus properly when it's pulled in 5 different directions. So a micro practice that you can start doing is to commit to yourself to close all your notifications, close your email, put your phone away for a limited amount of time, say 10 minutes to 15 minutes, and protect that time. You don't need perfect conditions, but you do need boundaries. A moment carved out for focused work. Even a short window without interruptions gives your brain the signal, this task matters. And that's often all it takes for your focus to start coming back online. If you really want to help yourself to focus, then the third micro practice is to create a focus ritual. You can help your brain to shift quickly into focus more easily by giving it a clear signal. Something that marks the transition between what you were doing before and this new period of focus. That's where a simple ritual comes in. It might be putting on noise-cancelling phones with your favorite music. It might be making your favorite coffee and start drinking it behind your desk. Or you could use a scented hand cream that you put on every time you start a focus session, especially smell. Gives very good clues to the brain. When repeated, the brain starts associating that cue with focus. And over time, your brain starts to recognize it. So that every time you do it, your brain will immediately kick into gear. You don't need to start implementing all these 3 micro practices at once, but I suggest you try them out. Try one and see what happens to your focus. I assure you, it really makes a difference. So let's move to the second challenge that most of us face, stress. Often, it's not just that our attention is pulled in different directions. It's that we're carrying a constant layer of tension underneath. Which brings us to the second challenge, stress. Stress is often seen as something to avoid, but it's actually a survival mechanism. When we sense danger, our body responds instantly, flooding us with cortisol and adrenaline, speeding up our heart, and sharpening our focus. In these moments, the emotional center of our brain, the amygdala, takes over, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and self-control, steps back. This process ensures that we can quickly evaluate the situation and decide how to react. This is essential for survival. If a lion is charging at you, you don't want to be contemplating your dinner options. But modern stress doesn't come from lions. It comes from deadlines. It comes from uncertainty. It comes from endless to-do lists. We all know that. And while short bursts of stress can boost performance, keeping us alert and engaged, chronic stress has the opposite effect. When stress becomes a constant state, the amygdala becomes overactive and the prefrontal cortex weakens, making it harder to think clearly, regulate emotions, and even remember things. So the key isn't eliminating stress, it's knowing how to bring ourselves back down so we don't stay in survival mode longer than we need. And one of the simplest ways to do that, does anybody know? It's breathing. So the fourth micro practice is one breathing technique, but there are several ones, the 4x4 box breathing. Breathing is one of the few ways we can send a direct signal to the brain that it's safe to relax. One technique that works very well is box breathing, and it's been used by musicians, by athletes, by soldiers, by many people to stay calm under pressure. So it's very simple. You inhale through your nose for 4 seconds. You hold your breath for 4 seconds. You exhale through your mouth for 4 seconds, and you hold again for 4 seconds. So let's please try together so you can experience the difference it makes. Inhale through your nose, 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath, 2, 3, 4. Exhale through your mouth, 2, 3, 4. And hold again, 2, 3, 4. One more time. Inhale through your nose. Hold breath. Exhale through your mouth. And hold again. Can you notice the difference? So you can do this anytime, before a meeting, after a stressful email, or when your mind is racing. Whenever just a few breaths can start to shift your nervous system from stress to feeling more balanced. So managing stress isn't just about calming down in the moment. It also means giving your brain regular opportunities to reset. We often treat rest like something we have to earn, something that gets squeezed in after we've done everything else. But to perform at its best, our brain needs downtime. Real, unstructured time where there's no pressure to achieve anything. When I was a child, we had a day which we called Alles mag dag, or anything goes days. It was this magical 24 hours where the only rule was that there was no rule. So total freedom reigned, I could do whatever I want, and I loved those days. But then, as I grow older, these Alles mag dags disappeared. Because I told myself I could do whatever I want already. I'm in control of my time. But the truth is, that's not really true. When we live our lives, often we often face so many demands on our time that we cannot make. So we normally don't have the control of our days. So it feels, even though we think we have control of our days, we don't really have that. So what I decided, I brought it back, the Alles mag dag. Now every so often I block out a day or even just a few hours, not with a plan, not with any to-do list. I don't try to be productive. I do whatever feels good in a moment. And at first these moments felt very strange because I was not used to having it. It felt even uncomfortable, but like I was wasting time. But I've come to see it as a great way to re-energize. Because when we constantly push ourselves, we lose perspective. We stay stuck in a reactive mode. But when we create space to breathe, reflect, and do nothing in particular, something shifts. You don't need a full day. You can start with an afternoon or a few hours in the morning. A few hours with no agenda, no pressure. Just let your mind wander. Let yourself off the hook and see what happens when you give yourself that space. But of course, for many of us, taking a break isn't necessarily the hardest part. It's what happens in our own minds when we do. Because even when we pause, there's often a voice that creeps in. The one that whispers, "Are you sure you should be doing this?" The one that tells us we're falling behind, that we're not quite good enough, that if we stop, even for a moment, we might lose our edge. That's the voice of self-doubt. And it's the final challenge I want to talk to you about today. Now, self-doubt isn't always a bad thing. In fact, it's often a sign that we're stepping out of our comfort zone, trying something new, stretching our abilities, or doing something that matters. That discomfort, that's part of growth. If you never feel self-doubt, you never really pushed yourself. But self-doubt becomes a problem when it stops being a signal that we're pushing our limits and instead turns into a story. When it moves from this feels hard to I'm not good enough. When it shifts from a moment of uncertainty to a full-blown narrative about who we are and what we are capable of. Because the problem is, we don't just hear that voice. We tend to believe it without questioning it, because it sounds familiar, because it sounds reasonable, because it sounds like the truth. But here's the thing, that voice isn't the truth. It's just a mental model, a shortcut your brain built, based on past experience, expectations, things you've heard or told yourself enough times that they feel real. But mental models are just that. They're models. And the good news is, models can change. So one way to start shifting that model is by learning to spot what I call automatic negative thoughts, or ANTs. Automatic negative thoughts are those thoughts that come up when you're doubting yourself. Maybe it is, I'm not ready for this, or I always mess this up, or I'm just not good enough. Think about it. What are the thoughts that quickly come up in your mind without even thinking about it, without questioning it? Now, instead of just accepting these thoughts as facts, take a step back and ask yourself, is this really the truth? Would I say this to a friend? Is this thought helping me right now? Or is there a more useful way of thinking about this? This isn't fake positivity. It's about creating enough space between you and your thoughts, instead of these thoughts letting it run the show. Because the more often we pause and question these automatic thoughts, the less power they hold. And over time, that tiny shift, just noticing and refraining these automatic negative thoughts, can start to reshape how we relate to ourselves. But often, as we know, it doesn't stop with one thought. One worry leads to another, and before we know it, we're in a spiral, caught in a stream of inner commentary that feels convincing and hard to escape. For example, imagine you had a minor argument with a friend. The first thought might be, I should not have said that. But it might spiral into, I always mess things up. I always push people away. She probably doesn't want to be my friend anymore. I will end up alone. What started as one small concern, one thing you did, has now turned into a sweeping negative narrative about yourself, one that undermines your confidence and fuels anxiety. When we get pulled into that kind of mental chatter, we need a different approach, one that helps us step back and create distance. When we're caught in a stream of negative self-talk, it can feel like truth because it sounds like us. So one way to create distance is to personify with your inner critic. I picture mine as a head teacher. She is from a strict boarding school. She's tall, stern, with piercing eyes and a permanent look of disapproval. She always wears black clothes. She always has her hands crossed on her body. And her voice is sharp, confident, and cold. Like she knows better than everybody else. I call her Beth. These days, when she shows up, I don't argue with her, but I just picture her tripping into the mud. And suddenly, she doesn't feel quite so powerful. So you can try this yourself. You don't need to be creative. You just need to give the voice a shape, a tone, a name even. When it pipes up, acknowledge it with humor or detachment. there you are again. The goal isn't to silence her or him completely. It's to stop mistaking it for your voice. To remember that you don't have to believe everything you think. In the end, self-doubt isn't something to fear or avoid. It's often a sign that we're stretching, doing something new, something we care about. That kind of self-doubt keeps us alert, reflective, and open to growth. But when it turns into running commentary that holds us back, that questions our worth, that's when it stops being helpful. And that's the version we want to catch, to question, and then gently let go, or let fall into the mud. Our brain isn't designed to make us calm, confident, or focused. It's designed to keep us alive. It scans for threats, avoids uncertainty, clings to habits, and resists change. Not because it's working against us, but because it's doing exactly what it was shaped to do. We focus on three key characteristics: the brain as a prediction machine, its evolutionary design for a world that no longer exists, and the fact that it can change, even in adulthood. Of course, the brain is far more complex than that, but even these few insights can get us started. When we understand just a little more about why our brain works and the way it does, we can begin to relate to ourselves differently, with less frustration and more perspective. And that opens the door to something many of us overlook. That change doesn't come from grand overhauls. More often, it starts with small adjustments. The kind that are easy to dismiss, but powerful when repeated. That's what these micro practices are. They're not big interventions. They're small, practical ways to work with your brain instead of pushing against it. We looked at 7 today. 3 to support focus, minimize task switching, blocking out distraction, and creating a focus ritual. 2 to help regulate stress. The first one is using your breath to calm your nervous system when you start feeling tension. The other one is to give yourself unstructured time to reset and to give your brain time to relax. And then 2, to interrupt self-doubt, learning to catch and reframe your automatic negative thoughts, and to create distance between you and your inner critic by making it into a person. These practices aren't dramatic. They're not designed to transform you overnight. But what they do is something quieter and arguably more powerful. They create small moments where you choose to respond differently, where you focus your attention on what matters, where you pause instead of push, and where you notice instead of judge. And when those moments start to add up, the way you move through your day begins to shift. Not because you've changed who you are, but because you've changed how you work with the brain you already have. Thank you.
Well, what a wonderful recipe for living. Thank you. I'm sure everybody's got, everybody might have thought something different from this, actually. It'd be interesting to be able to know that, but we can't know that. This is the time when you can all ask your questions. Do you want to do them one at a time? I think it's better as a conversation. But quick question, just say who you are, make your question, and quick answer, and we'll move round. Okay, what's your first? Don't hesitate. Yeah.
Can you? Oh, you can. Hi, Professor. Neeltje, hello. I'm really excited to
Can you
read your
stand
book.
up so we can see you?
Yes, okay. And I don't know if this is within the scope, but my question is, what about external critics? So if you have people around you that you may or may not respect, but people are telling you that you've done something wrong, or even if you think that you're not the one to blame, but people's voices are, how do you when do you know to apologise and not to apologise for your actions, and when you're convinced you're wrong or maybe you're wrong? Thank you.
It's a difficult question to answer because it depends on the circumstance, of course. But I think what is important to keep in mind is that we can't control others. We can only control ourselves. So we have no influence over others and their behaviors and their what they say or what they do. But we can control how we react and how we respond. So we need to look back at ourselves and think whether it's a valid criticism or not, and if it is, then we can take it on and relate to that. But if it's not, then it's up to us then to also decide to take that, to internalize it or not. I know it's hard sometimes because when it's an external critic, and particularly when it's a figure of authority, it becomes difficult and you often have to do something about it. But at the end of the day, it's about us and how we internally feel what is right or not, and that's a very personal decision.
Yes? Yep.
Thank you very much. My name is Tim Williams. I'm a colleague of Neeltje's at the Bank of England. And my question is actually for you, Professor Leard. So when you have listened to Neeltje's talk and seen her advice and listened to her experiences, are there certain elements that you perhaps recognize from your career? Are there certain habits that you already intuitively were doing? Are there habits that you wish you had been doing for longer? So I'm wondering how you view this talk and this advice in the context of your very esteemed career.
Well, I don't know why Neeltje asked me to chair this, but I think we are fellow spirits in some sense, because I started working on happiness and well-being about 25 years ago, and I actually started off by getting to know Daniel Kahneman, whose ideas are reflected in some of the things Neeltje has been saying about the different levels of the brain and so on. And through him I got to know various Buddhist scholars and Western neuroscientists who are interested in meditation and so on. So I came to believe that mind training is a very important thing, and that people can train their minds in the kind of ways that Neeltje has been saying, and we can train our responses as well, as she was just saying now. I did want to comment on the previous question, because one of the most impressive people I met through this pilgrimage was Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And I actually asked him once, as a sort of, like you go to a wise man, and there was somebody whose behaviour I wanted to influence, and he said exactly what Neeltje said. The only person whose behaviour you can influence is your own. And if you want to influence somebody else, just influence yourself. I thought that was tremendous. So anyway, no, I mean, I have learned a lot, I think, in the last 25 years. I've occasionally put it on paper. Yeah, everybody discovers routines for themselves, and some of these routines are very, very good and well tested in many cultures. breathing especially. But I think that automatic negative thoughts, of course, is a phrase that comes from cognitive behavioural therapy and Aaron Beck. And I think what we're seeing in our culture now, in this underground culture that we're talking about here, is a sort of fusion of ancient wisdom, Buddhism, Stoicism, so on, Christianity, with modern science, particularly led by cognitive behavioural therapy. And I think that this is transforming our society slowly. People are much more willing to talk about their own feelings than they would. Most people are not as willing as Neeltje, and I really admire her for that. It's one reason why I was delighted to come and do this. But no, I've said enough. Thanks, Paul. Yeah.
Hello. Hi there. Thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Tom Hikes, and this question is for both professors. Is there an age where you think that mind training becomes more difficult or even impossible? And my follow-up to that is there an age, like, can you start mind training from young, and should you?
Sorry, I didn't hear it.
Can you train your mind, and can you, like you were saying in the lecture, and is there an age from young where you can start training your mind?
Well, is there an age?
Is there an age?
An age where you can do that?
Either old or young.
Train your mind. So the brain is more plastic when you're younger. So until 25, the brain can adapt much quicker. So anything you learn as a child or as a young adult is that's when things settle much more in the brain. It's when we're adults that it becomes harder to rewire and to change those patterns, but it's still possible. And my personal belief, but we have to see, is that the whole idea of training your mind and to do brain training in various ways. I mean, we can think about meditation, we can think about training focus and many other things. It will become more something that people will start doing much more similar to that we were used to focus, or we used to not train our physical body. We were not thinking about it, and now almost everybody does some physical exercise. And I think the same will happen with our brain, that we start doing that more and more. It's very well established that training your brain and keeping it agile and keeping it working does help with preventing cognitive decline when we grow older. So for that reason alone, it's something that would be really good to do.
Hi, this question is to both professors, and excuse me if this has already been addressed in the talk. So, in today's age, the attack on our mind's attention, but also the dopamine and the stress levels is far more than it has ever been historically, psychologically, evolutionarily. So, when there is such an active increase in the threats, there should also be an active increase in the defense mechanisms that a person or a society should take. So, what would you think, or what according to you are the most advisable practices for an individual as well as for a population from a personal lens and also from a policy perspective?
Well, I think that the first one is to regain our focus and to regain our attention and our attention span, because our brain is addicted to all these things that come up, right? And because we don't even give ourselves time to just not have anything and not have any interaction. As soon as we're waiting for the bus, we already pick up our phone. We're always doing something. Most of us, when we work, we have our phone next to us, or we have our email open, and it's a big part of the reason is that we are addicted to it. Because that little thing that comes up, that little notification, that triggers dopamine. And that's what we're searching. So we are being part of this addiction loop. And that scattered attention is creating a lot of problems in the sense that everything takes a lot longer. We have to work longer hours in order to get the same stuff done. We relax less, that creates more stress, so we get into that negative spiral. And to me, a big part of it is to learn to focus and to learn again and retrain it, because you really have to retrain it. And that's why I was also suggesting that start with 10, 15 minutes. For many of us, 10, 15 minutes is already quite a challenge in the beginning. But you will see, once you do it and once you force yourself for a little bit to not look at your phone and not look at your email, you first will realize, hey, this is actually quite effective if I do that. So that's a positive reinforcement. And the second reason is that you also realize it's not that difficult once you've done it a couple of times. And then it becomes a habit, you rewire your brain, and then from 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you go to 25 minutes, you'll have an hour. And you will see how much more efficient things become.
Thank you for the talk today. My question is, like, for you as an academic, where do you draw the line between being like in a healthy like stress range and like an unhealthy stress range? And the same goes for self-doubt. Like, when do you like stop and say like, okay, this is actually harmful now? Because like as you mentioned, like some stress is usually beneficial, but like where's the limit for that? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's very personal. And I think that with stress, I think the best signal that you're too stressed is when you don't sleep well anymore. So when you feel stress and you feel stressed, but you can still work and you can still let go of it after your day's work, and you can still relax and fall asleep, then it's fine. Then it's what you can call productive stress. But if it keeps churning into your head and you can't sleep and you worry, then you're in a state of more chronic stress, and that's when it becomes unhealthy. So that, to me, that's really the key difference. Like, I still, even though I know all these things, I still experience quite a lot of stress, particularly like now with the book and then my academic job and how to balance that. But when it comes too overwhelming and you can't sleep, then I know, okay, now I need to really take a step back, because otherwise it's going to go too far. So that's the stress. I think that's the key. But when it comes to self-doubt, yeah, that's a very gradual, often, right? You keep telling these negative narratives, and with me, this imposter syndrome, it just strengthened over time, and it just became to a point where it was too much. Doubting yourself is not a problem. It's good. You challenge yourself. But if you constantly doubt yourself, if you constantly tell yourself negative stories about yourself, that becomes very unhealthy. Where exactly that moment lies, that's very hard to tell. But it's really that difference between can I change the narrative? Am I still able to change the narrative? I think that's where the difference comes in.
Hi, my name's Daniel Cunningham. Thanks a lot for the talk today. My question, I guess, on changing the narrative, is a little bit to do with, so we live in a society that very much values almost like status, ego, money driven, and it's very easy to value, or we do value ourselves based on our role and our job title and how much money we earn. I know, Professor, that you're working on something that is a way to try and put value to well-being, but it's such an intangible, it almost feels quite intangible, right, to measure your well-being, almost like, what's the point when you know you've learned a new language? Like, at what point do you know you've got control of this self-doubt or this self-talk? So I guess my question is how, from the top down, so there kind of needs to be a structural shift in the way that we value burnout and stress and climbing the corporate ladder, whatever, like, how do you think that the people at the top of the government can sort of filter that through to try and value well-being more in our society?
I think that's right.
Sorry.
It's how politicians value well-being more in society, right?
Oh, I see. Oh, well, yes. That's my time trying to make that happen. It's an extraordinary thing that they don't talk like this, because it's in their interests to make that their objective. Because we know that now elections are mainly determined by how happy people are in their lives, more than by the state of the economy. So it's in politicians' interest to talk about creating the conditions for happy living and doing it. I think I found one way of making some progress there. So rather than just talk about it, we must have a different objective, and that these are the things which contribute most to happiness. To say, why don't we take a procedure which is already used in government, namely cost-benefit analysis, and redirect it to measuring benefits properly in terms of human happiness. So actually, there's a little bit of that going on now in the spending review here. In principle, that's what the spending review is targeting. So we've had a little bit of success. I mean, it's early days, but things are moving, I think, in the right direction in terms of understanding amongst politicians of really what should be the overarching goal of government. Next. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Olivia Clarkey, and I have a question around, you mentioned the gradual benefit that you can see by implementing these micro habits over time. And I guess when you're battling with the lure of that dopamine hit instantly, it's one thing, I guess, to have great intentions to do the habits. Have you found any benefit, or I guess any tactics that work well in encouraging people to actually do them and not to just look at their notifications, or to do the thing that feels good in the moment and actually stick with it? And I guess an example is, I had a few friends that I thought could really benefit from coming here tonight, and rather than making that little bit of effort to leave the house, they succumb to the dopamine of sitting at home and watching TV instead. So I guess it's how to encourage the behaviour for the benefit that they will receive, but maybe not instantly enough to want to do it in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? People, the first thing is, it starts with making it important enough, right? That you want, that you experience a problem in your life and you think there might be a solution to it. So you want to change. But if there's no drive to change anything, then nothing really will happen. But once you have that desire, or your friends have a desire, I think then it's really about starting small. Like starting really with small ways where you change something, where you change your focus, or you implement one of these practices. Just because if you start very big with many things at the same time, you will feel overwhelmed, and then you start very quickly, you'll just toss it aside and you don't do it anymore. So I think it's really important that you start with something that feels attainable. It's what they call SMART goals. So they're I have to think of the acronym right now. It's SMART, but I can't. It's measurable, relatable, achievable, time-bound, and specific. So that they really are, and that there is a reason why they work, because you need to have something that feels that you are in control of. And when you make it too big and too complicated, we lose momentum, and we very quickly stop. doing it. So when you start something, starting smaller than you really thought in the beginning. If you want to go running, don't start with 30 minutes, but start with 10 minutes going outside, even 5 minutes. And that initial movement can then start to become a momentum.
Hi, Professor, thanks for the speech. So my question is kind of related with the first question. The girl asked about how should we respond to the critics from outside, not self-doubt. And I appreciate your ideas of we need to create a distance between our thoughts and our feeling of ourselves when we have some self-doubt. So my question is that it's not like the critics from the outside world or from other people, but more like from our friends or from some people who are familiar with, in the sense if we treat them like truthfully, and then sometimes we feel like rejected or excluded by the people we behaved pretty well before, and how should we respond to this kind of feeling? And as both of you mentioned that, like we can only influence ourselves, we cannot change the behaviors of other people. So I want to ask what your advice of how to build up a healthy mental mode to react with this kind of rejection. Thank you.
I think the first step is to not to make it into a big narrative about yourself. Sometimes something is more about the other person than about you. And we often, when somebody does something or somebody is very is negative towards us in a way, we internalize it and then create a whole big story about it. So we created a bigger narrative than the actual action. And I think that's where we are in control of that spiraling, of that behavior. So it's a lot about reflecting back in what's really happening, and then what story are we building from that interaction. And sometimes we have to decide to step away from people that are just not kind and good to us. And even though we might want it to be different, and we would like to be in a different relationship with them, that still, if they don't change, we, as we talked about before, we can't change them. So the only thing we can do is to step away from them.
I think I'm going to give myself the last question. So, as you know, I belong to this movement called Action to Happiness, which is based on what's called positive psychology, which is starting from cognitive behavioral therapy, really, but moving toward adding a more positive element to it. So, not just questioning your negative thoughts, but having positive thoughts which you can call on when you need positive thoughts. And the particular mechanism, which is a micro mechanism, is the gratitude exercise. So I know now about 10 people who say their lives have been changed by, at the end of every day, writing down 3 things that they're grateful for. And I have to say, it doesn't work for me, but I mean, thinking of whenever one needs to, of something one's grateful for, I think is a very useful habit. How do you feel that fits in with your scheme of things?
Oh, fits in perfectly. It's actually the last part of the book is about gratitude, because the brain has a negativity bias, so we err towards negative stuff in our lives, and we tend to overthink it and we focus on it. And when we do gratitude, when we really think about the good things in our life, and that can either be when you go to bed or afterwards when I wake up, is the first thing I do is think about 3 things I'm grateful for. You shift the whole start of your day or the end of your day, and it really is unbelievable how powerful it is. And often it's also things that we just take for granted, right? We take for granted that we have clean water running out of the taps, or often if we don't have anything with our health, we just take our health for granted, or we take for granted that we have a warm bed to sleep in. But once you be grateful for that, it really shifts your mind, and it's one of the most powerful things I've started doing. That in combination with morning walks, that was the second one.
Well, this has been a wonderful event. It was a beautiful talk, thank you so much. And we've had a really good conversation, and I hope all of you will find things that you can take away that will enrich your lives. I'd be very surprised if that wasn't the case. So, thank you so much.